Good afternoon, and welcome to the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences, or BBS, at the University of Texas at Dallas. I'm Steve Small, the Dean of BBS, and I'm happy to welcome you to our annual public lecture, Brain Matters, highlighting research conducted within the school. This is the 6th year for the BBS Brain Matters series. Its purpose is to share some of the most interesting and up-to-date research information on various brain-related topics in an easy-to-understand way. Today, we focus on the science and clinical care of hearing. Faculty at UT Dallas are at the forefront of research on hearing health, and their studies on hearing loss and tinnitus have been acclaimed throughout the world. Today, I'm very pleased that two of our top researchers are bringing their hearing knowledge to you in a format accessible to everyone. This is a topic of active research in our top-ranked Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing, and the gem of our school, our world-renowned Collier Center for Communication Disorders. The title of today's lecture is, quote, "All Ears, Hot Topics on Hearing Health and Tinnitus," unquote, and will be conducted by Drs. Colleen Prell and Edward Lobarinas, and moderated by Mr. Philip Roth. Let me tell you a little about each of them. Dr. Colleen Prell is the Emily and Phil Sheps Distinguished Professor of Hearing Science and the Chair of the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing at the University of Texas at Dallas. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Minnesota at Morris and her master's and doctoral degrees in psychology from the University of Michigan. Dr. Prell joined UT Dallas from the University of Florida in 2015, where she served as director of the Hearing Research Center. Dr. Colleen Prell heads our top-ranked Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing. She's a leading researcher in hearing loss prevention, particularly related to noise-induced hearing loss. Her work emphasizes the identification of cell death pathways, assessment of therapeutic agents that prevent loss, and the identification of auditory dysfunction. Her research paper with Dr. Lobarinas and others on an experimental drug treatment for noise-induced hearing loss was recently published in The Lancet, one of the premier medical journals in the world. For you academic aficionados, this paper has already been cited 100 times. She regularly publishes a large number of important research articles on prevention and treatment of hearing loss. Dr. Prell has served as the president of the National Hearing Conservation Association and serves on numerous task forces and working groups for professional organizations. Dr. Ed Lobarinas is Associate Professor of Speech, Language, and Hearing at UT Dallas and will be full professor starting in fall 2021. Dr. Lobarinas earned his bachelor's degree in experimental psychology and biology from Rutgers University in 1996, 3 cheers from all of you from New Jersey, followed by a master's degree in audiology in 2004, and a PhD in communication disorders and sciences in 2007 from the State University of New York at Buffalo. Dr. Lobarinas is a leading researcher on animal models of tinnitus and functional changes in hearing, focusing on the so-called hair cells of the inner ear, which are the main transducers of sound in the inner ear, with information subsequently sent to the brain. His research is critical to understanding hearing loss and its effects on higher auditory function. In addition to his high-impact paper with Dr. Prell, he also regularly publishes basic scientific papers on hearing, focusing on the sensory physiology of the inner ear. One recent article in the Frontiers of Neuroscience has already been cited 50 times by other scientists. Dr. Lobarinas has been recognized by the American Academy of Audiology as a Jerger Future Leader of Audiology and has received many grants from governmental agencies and industry to study basic mechanisms of sensory transduction in animals, as well as human work on hearing protection devices and the effect of sound suppression on firearms to reduce the effect of impulse noise exposure. Mr. Phil Roth is a communications manager in the UT Dallas Office of Communications. In that role, he writes stories about interesting research and people at UT Dallas and often shares that information with local and national news media. One of his areas of responsibility is the Collier Center for Communication Disorders, where he works with Drs. Prell and Lobarinas. Phil has worked in communications for more than 30 years with expertise in writing, public relations, speech writing, social media, and leadership. He has a bachelor's degree in journalism from Arizona State University and is about to earn his master's degree in public affairs from UT Dallas. Welcome to Brain Matters, and I turn you over to Mr. Phil Roth, who will moderate the session.
Thank you, Dean Small, and thank you all for being with us today. Today, doctors Prell and Lobarinas will be talking about some of the big questions regarding hearing. So here's how we're formatting today's Brain Matters event. We will start with doctors Prell and Lobarinas presenting their information. And after the presentations are complete, we will begin the question and answer portion. To ask a question, please click on the chat bubble in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. You can do this as you go along, or you can do it at the end. If you need closed captioning, that is available by clicking on the CC at the bottom of the screen. The approach we're taking today is to discuss 6 common questions professors often get asked about hearing. So here they are. Starting with number 1, how loud is too loud for personal music devices? How can I protect my hearing in noisy places? I've heard that over-the-counter hearing aids, I've heard about over-the-counter hearing aids. Are they any good, or should I get one? I've heard that there's a link between hearing loss and dementia. Should I be worried? I think my hearing is fine, but I struggle with background noise. Is there something wrong? I have bothersome ringing in my ear. What should I do about it, and where should I go? So we have a lot of very important information to cover today. So let's get started with Dr. Colleen Prell.
Thank you, and I appreciate everybody joining us today. I'm going to start with a question about how loud is too loud for personal music devices. We'll talk a little bit about the maximum output on some of these devices and the difference between how loud they possibly can go versus how loud people choose to set them at. Then we'll talk about some safer listening options. This is a really common question that I get regarding hearing loss in children and whether they're listening at levels that are safe or too loud. Can I have the next slide, please? One of the things that I want to share with you is how loud these devices can go. On the horizontal or x-axis of the figure that you see in front of you, you see the percentage of volume control. So if you think about your music player device, it has a volume setting, and you can turn it up or down, and you can watch the slider on the volume bar go all the way up to the very top with the whole thing lit up, or when you set it quieter, you see a smaller portion of that slider lit up. What you're seeing here is how loud the music is as you adjust that volume slider. And so if you look at 100% of the volume control, you can see those sound levels are over 100 dB, which is a hazardous listening level. We typically define a safe listening level as 85 dBA. This is based on data from occupational workers and sounds that will cause hearing loss in people who are exposed to noise day in and day out. The 85 dBA safe listening level for most of these music player devices is reached at about 70 to 80% of the volume setting. So that gives you some information about where a safe listening range would be. Let's look a little bit more closely at how we define safety. Can I have the next slide, please? On this next slide, you see the trade-off between how loud it is and how long you can safely listen for. So if you think about that 85 dB sound level, 70 to 80% of the volume, you can listen to that for about 8 hours. That's about the level of a blender. Might be a common appliance that you would think of with those sound levels. If you think about that 100 dB sound level that was at 100% of the volume slider, you can listen to that safely for about 15 minutes. So a child or an adult who is listening to their music player with the volume turned all the way up would potentially be putting themselves at risk when they listen at those very high sound levels. If you look at the numbers within this table, you can see the specific trade-off. We typically think of every 3 dB increase in sound level as doubling the sound level risk. So as we go from 85 to 88, you see the time is cut in half. From 88 to 91, the time is cut in half to 2 hours. And that's how we get to that 15-minute duration that would be allowed at that highest maximum sound level. Now, when we talk about safe listening levels, I want to alert you to one caveat. We're talking about the average person when we talk about 8 hours at 85 dB being safe. Some people are more vulnerable, some people are less vulnerable, and we don't have any way of predicting who is who. So for those people who are the most vulnerable, they would need to have the volume down at 50 to 60% in order to protect their ears against any injury. So one of the things that's really important to remember is if your ears are ringing or things sound muffled, then you've done damage regardless of what these tables tell you about what should be safe. Next slide. A really important factor is how loud people actually choose to listen. And so we've looked at the way that devices can be very loud. Again, what we're looking at here on the horizontal x-axis is how much background noise there is. So you can think about a quiet laboratory setting or a quiet office setting where nothing loud is happening. People generally choose very quiet listening levels. You can see that for any of the different ear pieces that they're using, they're listening at about 70 dBA, very safe listening levels. Now, think about where people usually use music player devices. They might use them on a bus or on a subway. They might use them at a gym where there's loud exercise equipment. And in those cases, as that background noise gets louder and louder, the sound levels that people choose to listen to their devices at are increased. And so you can see that they increase from 70 up to 90 dB as the background noise gets louder. Now, if you choose particular types of earbuds, you don't have to turn it up as much. There's a category of devices that are called sound isolating devices. You can see some examples shown in the picture on the right. And what those devices do is they act almost like an earplug that prevents the background noise from getting into your ear, and so you don't have to turn it up as much. So the red line shows you the listening levels people chose with a regular earbud, and the blue line shows you the listening levels that people chose with sound isolating earbuds. So they help you listen at safer levels, but still appreciate your music. Another option is what we would call a volume limited earphone, and those are specifically designed so that they can't be turned up above 85 dBA so that you don't even have the option of overexposing your ears. Next slide. So some take-home message about music players are they can produce hazardous sound levels. Most of the studies that are out there suggest that the average person is listening at safe levels, but at least half of the studies that are out there show that at least one person in the group of subjects was at risk for hearing loss based on listening at dangerously high or dangerously long durations of time. The national data suggests that about 13% of 12 to 19-year-olds have hearing loss that's consistent with noise-induced hearing loss. This is a fairly small percentage when we think about the percent that's impacted by occupational noise or military noise, but this is still about 6 million adolescents. So the numbers are significant. You should listen to sounds with a volume of no more than 70 to 80%. If temporary deficits are experienced, if things sound muffled, if your ears are ringing, it was hazardous and you should listen for at quieter levels or for shorter periods the next time. And think about those earphones. Think about volume limiting or sound isolating earphones to help you listen more safely. There's a lot of health and music apps that will help you track your exposure. And the World Health Organization is working very hard on this with their Make Listening Safe campaign. They've actually published safe listening guidance for music players with the International Technical Union. And so as devices that meet those standards come out, please watch for them. They'll be a good safe choice for you. Next slide. I want to talk briefly about how you can protect your hearing in other settings as well. Most people are very familiar with earplugs or earmuffs that they can use with hazardous sound, and you've probably seen the yellow foam earplugs or the over-the-ear earmuffs when you mow your lawn. What you might be less familiar with are some of the specialized products that help you enjoy music while you're wearing earplugs, or that help you hear the things that you need to hear while you're wearing earplugs or earmuffs. We'll talk about 2 of those products today so you know what those options are. Next slide. The first one is high fidelity musician earplugs. You can buy these over the counter, or you can buy them in a custom molded form that is specific to your ears. The musician's earplugs provide a little bit less attenuation than a traditional occupational earplug because most people want to hear the music that they're listening to while using these products. The other unique feature about musicians' earplugs is they have special filters in them, and so they don't distort sound as much. A foam earplug will have different amounts of sound reduction at different frequencies or different pitches that the music is delivered. And the musicians' earplugs are designed to have a very flat attenuation so they don't distort the sound. So if you go to loud concerts, if you rehearse with bands in loud venues, if you're exposed to amplified music, either as a performer or a listener, these are a great option for you to consider trying to help you protect your hearing. Next slide. The other product I want you all to be familiar with are electronic hearing protectors. These are devices that let you hear quiet sounds. Some of them even have an amplifier so that they'll make quiet sounds louder. So if you have a little bit of hearing loss and you're going hunting, you're able to hear yourself making noise as you're walking, or you're able to hear the person who's walking next to you and talking quietly with you without taking your hearing protection out. But when a firearm is discharged or when there's some other loud sound, then they act just like a regular hearing protector and they attenuate that sound to safe levels. And so you can hear everything that you need to hear when things are quiet, but then they protect your hearing when they're loud. So if you hunt or go to the target range and you want to be able to understand things when weapons are not being discharged, these are a great solution to think about. Next slide. A few thoughts on when hearing protection is needed. If you have to shout to be heard by someone who's standing at arm's length, sound levels are probably at least 90 dB and hearing protection is needed. If you have to shout at less than arm's length, the levels are even higher, so take quiet breaks, limit your listening time, and wear hearing protection. Again, if your ears are ringing or if you're full, your ears were damaged, make sure you wear hearing protection the next time you're in that scenario. And think about sound level meter apps. There's great apps that will track your exposure and help you protect your hearing. Next slide. Just very quickly, there's a number on the hearing protector package. You can see the 10, the 23, the 33. These tell you something about how much attenuation the earplugs provide. Most people don't wear their hearing protection correctly and don't get as much protection as the packaging indicates. Usually we would say subtract 7 dB and then cut it in half to figure out how much protection the average person will get. Don't rely too much on the numbers in any case. Comfort matters. Wearing an earplug with a lower NRR that you actually wear consistently and correctly will protect your hearing much, much more effectively than buying something with a very large NRR number and putting it in your pocket because it's not comfortable. Next slide. So, to leave you with a few take-home messages, the best hearing protector is the one you'll wear consistently and correctly. Some are made for audibility needs. Think carefully about musicians' products and electronic products if you want to hear or appreciate sounds in the environment. If sounds are very loud, double up your hearing protection. Put an earplug underneath an earmuff. And remember, temporary changes in your hearing are a signal that damage has occurred. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Lobarinas, for a discussion about what you might do if damage has already occurred.
Thank you. Thank you. The next the next topic that we'd like to cover is over-the-counter hearing aids. And this was a really hot topic right before the pandemic. It was reaching levels where these devices have already been approved by the federal government and were poised to really make a big splash on the market. So people often ask me, what are these devices and should I get one? So let's just start with what an over-the-counter hearing aid is. So over-the-counter hearing aids are essentially a new category of hearing aids that individuals would be able to purchase directly without consulting a hearing health professional. And the idea behind these is that these would fill the space between personal sound amplification products, PSAPs as some people call them, which you can purchase now if you wanted to. There are a number of products that are aimed at presumably helping you hear better. And then on the other end of the spectrum is a traditional hearing aid, and these devices would occupy the space in between. And the idea or the target for these devices are adults who believe that they have mild to moderate hearing loss. So please note that these devices are only approved for adults, and the devices would be regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of things to think about for people who are considering over-the-counter hearing aids. The first one is that the average time between the onset of a hearing loss and somebody seeking intervention where it really becomes noticeable is about 5 to 10 years. So it takes quite a while, and oftentimes people come to see us when they've run out of options or when they can no longer compensate. Most people who have mild to moderate hearing loss are completely unaware that they have hearing loss, and this has been shown by National Health Survey data, where individuals will report that their hearing is normal, but when you actually test them, they have a mild to moderate hearing loss. So again, most individuals for whom these devices are meant to target are not even aware that they have a hearing loss. Another thing to think about is that oftentimes the hearing loss is potentially a symptom of an underlying medical problem. And so by not seeking professional help, you may delay treatment of underlying medical complications associated with the hearing loss. And again, just to reiterate, the onset of hearing loss in adults tends to progress slowly. So by the time you're really aware of it, you're probably outside the range of what these products are intended to do. Next slide. So I think that one of the best ways to explain it to people who may not be familiar with hearing is that we have two problems with hearing loss. One is the dynamic range. And what I mean by that is the space between I can barely hear something and something is too loud. One of the things that happens that often people don't understand is that with a mild to moderate hearing loss, this high level of a sound is really loud and uncomfortable doesn't really change, but the softest sound that you can hear begins to creep up. Now, what that means is that the distance or the space between I don't hear it, I hear it, oh boy, it's getting loud, is much, much smaller. So that's problematic because if you're thinking about just making everything louder, that's really not going to work. And the challenge for a hearing aid is essentially taking all that information that is not audible and squeezing it into a smaller space. So that's problem number one, that it's really kind of a problem of that you have a reduced amount of space in which to put information that is useful to you. The second problem is that the hearing loss is not flat. And what I mean by that is that you don't lose the ability to hear across all sounds. So in many circumstances, you lose the ability to hear some sounds, but not others. If we look at the figure on the left, you can see that the black lines represent different patterns of hearing loss. And I want you to note the yellow, the yellow cartoon behind that, and that's what we call the speech banana. And that represents sounds from low pitch, like the left side of a piano, and then progressively as we move to the right, it's high pitch. Anything below that black line you can hear, anything above it you can't hear. And so what you can see is that no hearing losses, the hearing losses are not the same. So this is problematic if you're trying to use a sort of a device that's supposed to aid everybody, and you're actually trying to do this on yourself. So there's some pretty significant challenges. Again, just to reiterate, most of the people for whom these devices were intended for are not even aware that they have hearing loss. So typically people that would seek these devices have hearing loss that needs some professional guidance to find solutions that are appropriate for them. Next slide. So what are some of the things that you might want to think about, or some recommendations? So if you or somebody that you care about believe that you might be a candidate for these types of devices, my recommendation is that to seek a professional evaluation. I would second that. I always recommend a medical and an audiological evaluation. Remember that these devices are only intended for mild to moderate hearing loss, and most of those individuals are not aware that they have hearing loss. These devices lack the type of programmability that's available in a hearing aid in order to fit those types of problems, the configuration, the shape of your hearing loss, and the amount of space that you have left. And one of the things that people shy away from is the upfront cost of a traditional hearing aid. And whereas that upfront cost can be quite high, a pair of hearing aids can range from $2,000 to $6,000. It's a good idea to think about the lifetime of a hearing aid, somewhere between 5 to 10 years. So the actual cost per year, per month, per day, per hour is not as big of a barrier as people often think. And the last thing is that many states have hearing aid trial periods. So even if you're not sure, you can actually try a hearing aid and not have to bear the entire cost, excuse me, if that's not a solution that works for you. The next slide. So along with the question about over-the-counter hearing aids, I often get a lot of questions about hearing loss and dementia. A lot of people are worried, either themselves or perhaps their parents, about the possibility that hearing loss will lead to dementia. And unfortunately, this has been fueled by a lot of advertisements, and particularly advertisements that are targeted to seniors, suggesting that if they don't get a hearing aid, that they're going to develop dementia. So let's just start with what we mean by dementia. So dementia is a collective term to describe a number of symptoms. Usually forgetfulness is one of them, and memory impairment, poor communication, and reduced thinking ability. So I don't want you to think of it as a single disease, but a way to describe these types of symptoms. And it's not really clear whether the dementia causes brain cells to die, or brain cells to die, or what's causing the dementia. So it's still unclear in many cases, what the underlying cause of the disease is, or the symptoms. Next slide, please. Okay. So as it stands right now, there's little compelling evidence that hearing loss directly causes dementia. And one of the things that I'd like to remind you is the difference between causation and correlation. I like this cartoon on the left. The cartoon shows ice cream. It says ever since people started eating more ice cream, there's more sunburns. Now we of course know that ice cream doesn't cause sunburn. They tend to occur in the summer. So it's the heat of the summer that's driving people to eat more ice cream, and also causing sunburns. So just because two things happen in the same space doesn't mean that one caused the other. And this is one of the issues that I'd like to think about when I think about hearing loss and dementia. They often occur together, and they often occur as a function of age. Now, just because it's not clear that dementia leads to hearing loss, we don't want to leave hearing loss untreated, because hearing loss is almost certain to make the symptoms of dementia worse. So untreated hearing loss can have a significant effect on the severity of the symptoms because of lack of stimulation. Next slide, please. So there's a few theories, and I put theories in quotes, that have been put forth regarding the relationship between hearing loss and dementia. The first one is hearing loss and dementia share a common mechanism, that there's this third variable that we don't yet understand that is the causal factor that is causing both dementia and hearing loss, but not that hearing loss is causing dementia or the other way around. The second one is that cognitive decline leads to reduced auditory perception, so that the dementia actually precedes the hearing loss. So there's cognitive decline, and you're unable to process auditory information, although there's low level of support for this hypothesis. The third one is that what I like to call like the burnout hypothesis is that hearing loss increases the demand on cognitive resources, leading to more cognitive demand, and that leads to dementia. Again, there's not a lot of strong evidence that you're going to burn your brain out because of hearing loss. And the fourth is untreated hearing loss may produce a brain reorganization and increased social deprivation, leading to cognitive decline. Again, I want to remind you that these look like they're talking about things that occur together, but no causal link has been established between dementia and hearing loss. And if you think about it, there are a lot more people with hearing loss that don't have symptoms of dementia. So they're correlated, but it has not been established that one causes the other. Next slide, please. Okay. So what are my recommendations? You certainly don't want to leave hearing loss untreated. So auditory deprivation from untreated hearing loss has been shown repeatedly to have a negative effect on quality of life and overall health. The loss of interaction and stimulation via the auditory pathway and being able to communicate with others likely contributes to the symptoms getting worse. And it's important to think that the cost of intervention of obtaining a hearing aid certainly outweigh the effects of leaving the hearing loss untreated, especially for our elders. And there's some suggestion that amplification may slow down the progression of the symptoms. So you may not be able to prevent or reverse the disease, but you can certainly slow down the progression. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Dr. Prell.
Thank you. The next topic that we're going to talk about is hearing and background noise. So you've heard about hearing loss, where you lose the ability to hear quiet tones. But one of the things that patients most often complain about is difficulties hearing in background noise. So it's not that they can't hear anything, it's that they can't understand what is being said when the listening conditions are difficult. You might have experienced this in a loud restaurant. You might have experienced this in a crowded convention hall. Some people might experience this in hallways at schools and shopping malls, anywhere where there's lots of sound that is bouncing off of the environment and making it difficult to understand what the people talking to you are saying. We have a lot of evidence showing us that this is a common challenge for workers who are exposed to occupational noise. We have a lot of data that this is a common challenge for people who are getting older. We even have data showing that there's more and more young people who are having trouble hearing in background noise. And there is an entire literature that's emerging on what are the specific cells that are damaged that cause these problems. There's been a fundamental change in our understanding of hearing in background noise and cells that are involved in hearing and noise and cells that are vulnerable to noise, where we once thought that if your thresholds recovered, everything was fine and the ear was completely recovered. We now know that's no longer true, and it may be that this subclinical pathology to the ear is responsible for some of these hearing and noise deficits. Next slide, please. I want to share with you some work that a student in my lab collected as a PhD student. And what she did was she followed people who did typical recreational things that they normally do. So the participants came into the lab, they had a number of hearing tests, including tests for how well they understood words in noise backgrounds. And then they were asked to come back to the clinic after they had gone to some loud event. Some went to concerts, some went to bars or nightclubs, some went to music festivals, one went to a movie theater. So there was an entire range of where people went, how loud it was, and how long they stayed. And we had them measure how loud it was and keep track of how long they stayed so that we were able to come up with an 8-hour equivalent sound level for them. And in that first panel on the left with the red squares inside it, you can see the 8-hour equivalent sound exposure level for each of the participants. And so 60 dB is a very low, safe exposure. 110 dB is a very loud, hazardous exposure. If you think back to our original data tables, the safe duration would be less than 15 minutes. And this is an 8-hour, the equivalent of staying in that exposure for 8 hours. So we looked at how did the participants do on this difficult hearing and noise test when they came back the next day after this exposure was ended. And you can see that the higher the noise exposure was, the further to the right we go along that x-axis, the bigger the change in their performance. And I've drawn a box around it for you to show that the people who had the most noise had the biggest deficits in their hearing and noise performance. Now, they all recovered over the course of the next week, but noise exposure has cumulative effects. And so somebody who is damaging their ear at a recreational event and doing this on a repeated basis runs the risk that these changes might ultimately be permanent changes. And the changes really compromise the ability to hear in difficult listening situations. Next slide. So in this next slide, what I'm showing you is the participants who had what we would consider hazardous exposures, the exposures that were 90 dB or above for the equivalent of 8 hours. And we're looking at their performance on different listening conditions. And so the signal to noise ratio is how big is the difference between the background noise that they're listening in and the target words that they're listening for. So at 24 dB, the words are a lot louder than the background noise, and people get 100%. 5 per ear is the best they can do. When you look at the opposite end of the spectrum with 0 dB difference, where the words and the background noise are at the exact same level, you can see that people do very poorly. Now, when people came back to the lab the day after these loud events, you can see that the red squares show much poorer performance. They show fewer words correct per ear in those difficult listening conditions. So when the signal to noise ratio was poor, when they had 0, 4, or even 8 dB of difference between the words and the background, they did more poorly. When the listening conditions were very good, when they had the words much louder than the background noise, we didn't see deficits in those conditions. So noise affects the ability to understand words and noise when the listening conditions are difficult. Next slide. So what I would like you to remember as you leave this presentation today is that hearing and noise difficulties are very, very common. And there are strategies that make it easier to understand what people are saying. You can ask others to speak clearly. You can ask them to face you while they're speaking so that you're able to take advantage of some of the facial cues while their mouth is moving. Choosing well-lit areas and watching the speaker is a helpful strategy for many people. If you're in a noisy environment, sit with the background noise behind you to try and reduce the extent to which it interacts with the person you're listening to. And if you're in a situation where masks still need to be worn, try and encourage the use of clear masks because it'll give you access to those visual cues. Now, for some people, this might not be enough. You might find that you're still struggling to hear in difficult listening conditions. And if you find that you're avoiding going to restaurants or going out with people who you would normally spend time with, then it's time to seek help to find out if there are other strategies that can help you be involved in conversations even when it's noisy. So go to an audiologist, have your hearing checked, have them measure your hearing and noise ability. If there is a threshold issue, hearing aids can restore some of the audibility, and many hearing aids have noise reduction algorithms to try and subtract out some of that noise from the background to make it easier to understand what you're specifically listening to. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Lobarinas to answer our final question for today.
Thank you. Tinnitus is one of the topics that I enjoy talking about probably the most. I think that often people are surprised as to how long tinnitus has been a problem. So I'd like to give you a very brief history of tinnitus. So some of the, so first let's define the type of tinnitus that we're going to talk about today, and that is subjective tinnitus. So subjective tinnitus is the phantom perception, a sound that is only heard by that person and no one else. And this sound has no corresponding external sound. So how long has this been around? So if we go back in history and we go 2000 years BC, we find early evidence of documentation of Egyptians not only identifying tinnitus as a problem, but also developing cures. These were mixtures of oil and tree sap and other types of medicinal compounds that were poured into the ear in an effort to treat a bewitched ear. And if you fast forward to 400 BC, the Greeks were also talking about tinnitus, and again, not only talking about what an awful experience it could be, but also they believed that tinnitus was actually a sound in your ear. And by using an external sound, that external sound would push the internal sound out. So even the Greeks 400 years BC were discussing using sound therapy for the treatment of tinnitus. If you look at the ancient Hebrew text in the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, we see that it's a sort of an encyclopedia, and within it there's a medical section, and they talk about the curse of Titus. And the idea that if you walk by the ocean or you walk by a sound, that might be a way to treat tinnitus. So the idea that tinnitus is just a result of the Industrial Revolution or noisy headphones or things like that is actually not accurate. This has been a problem for thousands of years. Next slide, please. So what causes tinnitus? So we find ourselves again in the situation of causation versus correlation. So there are some cases of objective tinnitus. Remember I said subjective tinnitus, only the person hears it. There are some cases of objective tinnitus. So there's a real sound, for example. Oftentimes there's venous malformation. So you may get a venous hum that's close to the internal ear. Or there may be some underlying medical pathology, cardiovascular disease, other things that are identifiable and are triggering a phantom sound sensation. But in the majority of cases, we're talking about idiopathic, which means unknown cause, idiopathic tinnitus in patients. Next slide, please. So again, oftentimes you'll hear that, the hearing loss causes the tinnitus. Well, most people that have hearing loss don't have tinnitus, but it certainly is a risk factor and they are correlated with each other. So what are some other things that are correlated with tinnitus? Well, the number one is aging. So there's a strong correlate between aging and tinnitus. As we get older, the probability of developing tinnitus increases. A history of noise exposure. Certainly, there's a strong link between exposure to noise, noise-induced hearing loss, and tinnitus. And some of the people who are at most risk are musicians, people who work in a noisy environment, and military personnel. Head and neck trauma. Head and neck trauma has also been associated with tinnitus. Middle ear problems. The history of middle ear disease is correlated with tinnitus. Poor cardiovascular health, Meniere symptoms, or sometimes people call it Meniere's disease. That's another one where it's really the symptoms, but we don't know the underlying cause of Meniere's. And in some cases, you may have a benign tumor in the brainstem. So this is why I always reiterate, that if you have tinnitus, it's good to seek the help of a medical professional just to rule out any potential treatable underlying medical conditions. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, the other important thing to remember about tinnitus is that you really have two parts of this. Number one is that the actual ringing sensation. And the second, and perhaps more important part of this, is the emotional reaction. So oftentimes you will find that there are people who have tinnitus, but are able to manage it, or not bothered by it very much, whereas others may have the same level of tinnitus and it's catastrophic. Next slide, please. I think we skipped one. You'll go back one. Okay, let's move forward then. Okay, so what are some of the treatments that have been shown to work? Well, the first one is sound therapy. Oftentimes people have hearing loss and they also have tinnitus. And by having the sound stimulation, not only are they able to get some help with their hearing loss, but oftentimes it will help the tinnitus or make it less noticeable. There's a program called Tinnitus Retraining Therapy that was pioneered by Paolo Jastroboff. This is a type of counseling technique that has been shown to be very, very effective at managing the reaction to tinnitus. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, that has been used by the VA very effectively to manage tinnitus among military personnel. And the last one is mindfulness, relaxation techniques. These are designed to help people increase their internal resources in order to better manage the phantom sensation of tinnitus. Next slide. What are some of the other treatments that are emerging, but perhaps have not reached the level where they're widely accepted? The first one is vagal nerve stimulation, and a lot of this work was actually done at UTD by Dr. Kilgard and his colleagues. And the idea behind this is to counteract the sympathetic nervous system. A lot of people who suffer from tinnitus have a very high state of anxiety and distress. And vagal nerve stimulation has been shown to help other problems such as anxiety and depression, and may be helpful in some people by counteracting that hyper activity from the sympathetic nervous system. Deep acupuncture. The literature on acupuncture has been mixed, but more recent data, there's studies coming out of Korea that have shown that deep stimulation by acupuncture, referred to as DECI, actually triggers the same mechanisms as vagal nerve stimulation and may be helpful in managing tinnitus distress. Pharmacotherapy, drugs to treat tinnitus, most of the time these are used off-label. There's only a few types of tinnitus that may respond to pharmacological treatment. One of them is carbamazepine for typewriter tinnitus, although that has not been replicated. There was some work in Brazil on substance abuse. Some of the drugs that were used for people who had alcohol abuse actually were effective in attenuating noise-induced tinnitus. But again, that's work that's ongoing. Deep brain stimulation. Deep brain stimulation work that has been done by De Ritter and colleagues in Europe has shown that in cases of extreme tinnitus, there's a subset of patients that may respond to deep brain stimulation. And finally, transcranial magnetic stimulation. This is work that's again been done primarily in Europe. And these techniques have been used in people who are also comorbid for depression and mental health problems, who also have tinnitus. And as a side effect, they've reported that the tinnitus has improved somewhat. But again, these are still somewhat experimental, and there's some positive evidence, but the final chapter hasn't been written yet. Next slide. So what are my recommendations if you or someone you care about experiences tinnitus, and it's particularly if it's bothersome? Number one is a medical evaluation. You want to rule out the potential of underlying treatable disease that may be manifesting itself as tinnitus or have a side effect that's tinnitus. A hearing evaluation. Although most people with hearing loss don't have tinnitus, most people with tinnitus have hearing loss. A tinnitus evaluation to understand, how severe is the problem? What is your individual ability to cope, and what strategies might be customized and be more effective for you? And typically, patients will benefit from one or more. The majority of patients will derive benefit from one of the strategies. And so, if you go through this process of the evaluations and identifying your specific needs, you're very likely to have success in managing your tinnitus, particularly that bothersome tinnitus. Next slide. I'll turn it over back to Dr. Prell for some general take-home messages on today's session.
We're both very grateful that we've had a chance to talk with all of you today. Going back to our original list of 6 questions, we've tried to highlight some of the most important information for you to take away from today's session. When you think about personal music players, please remember that they can produce hazardous sound levels, and think about choosing sound isolating or volume limiting earphones to help prevent overexposure. If you don't choose to use earphones that help you listen more safely, please make sure that you're paying attention to any symptoms that you have and remembering to listen at lower levels or for shorter periods the next time you listen if you have ringing in your ears or things sound muffled to you. There's many earplug and earmuff solutions. Some of them are targeted for specific listening needs. If you just want to quiet your lawnmower, a pair of earmuffs are a great investment. If you want to be able to hear other things that are important for you to hear while you're wearing those earmuffs or those earplugs, think about electronic hearing products. If you want to appreciate music more safely, make sure that you think about using musicians' hearing protection products. If you're considering an over-the-counter hearing aid for your hearing needs, please consider consulting an audiologist first to make sure that these products are going to meet your needs and that you'll be happy with your investment. Untreated hearing loss is also associated with decreased social engagement and cognitive decline, and so amplification can enhance quality of life if you're having difficulty participating. It may also be helpful hearing a noise. Difficulty hearing a noise, as we talked about, this is very common. It can occur even if you don't have classic hearing loss. So choose good listening habits, well-lit areas, noise behind you, watching carefully when people are speaking and asking them to speak clearly towards you. Those good listening habits may help, or hearing devices may help. And finally, if you have bothersome ringing in your ears, medical and audiological evaluation are needed. We really appreciate your time. We have saved time for questions from you, our audience, and so I will turn it over to Mr. Roth to walk us through your questions.
Thank you, Drs. Prell and Lobarinas. Those are very interesting presentations. Just a reminder that you can ask a question through the little chat bubble at the top of the window. So let me say it again. Remember that you can click on the chat bubble in the upper right-hand corner of the screen to ask any questions you may have. So we have a few in. So to get started, here are some that have come in. Oh, let me throw out this one that came in. A couple of people were interested in seeing some of the charts again. So for those people, you will be able to see a recording of this event again. Look in the link for the chat to see that later. So one is, a lot of these are related to tinnitus, Dr. Lobarinas. Are these tinnitus treatments designed to reduce the ringing or to control people's reaction to the ringing?
I'm guessing I'm on. Yeah, unfortunately, the majority of these devices and treatments have been aimed at reducing tinnitus reaction, not tinnitus itself. When people ask me what my gold standard is, my gold standard is to pursue treatments that actually get rid of the signal. And that, in many cases, people will report that the ringing has been reduced, but it really, when you look at it more closely and you actually measure whether or not the ringing is reduced, the ringing has not changed, but the reaction has been substantially reduced. So most treatments now have been focused on reducing the emotional reaction to tinnitus, and there isn't strong evidence that any of these treatments actually gets rid of the sound of tinnitus, with the exception of the Tegretol study, but that was only for a very specific type of tinnitus known as typewriter tinnitus.
Okay, so here's another tinnitus related question. As someone with Meniere's, including extreme tinnitus, what is your opinion on the potential new medicine that is on the FDA fast track? The person doesn't list that medicine. I don't know. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not familiar with it. I think we have a couple of problems. You know, number one, we don't really know the underlying pathophysiology of Meniere's disease. So Meniere's disease is defined by the symptoms, not by the underlying pathology. And so I'd have to know sort of, is it a specific cluster of symptoms that are believed to be driving the Meniere's? And if so, what is the mechanism of this drug and what is this drug trying to do?
And one thing, obviously, COVID-19 is in the news a lot. And one question that we got is there a connection between COVID infection and hearing loss?
Yeah, I've gotten this question more and more recently. You know, one of the problems with COVID are the symptoms. So the symptoms of COVID, respiratory distress, high fever, you know, being in the intensive care unit, all of these things where people are really, really sick, you know, put a tremendous stress on the inner ear. And so what you're seeing is individuals who have either had hypoxia or other problems, or they've suffered neurological damage, and all of these are correlated with both tinnitus and hearing loss. So it's not the virus itself, but the people getting sick, getting really, really sick, that you're having increased reports of both hearing loss and tinnitus.
This one, I think Dr. Prell is probably focused on you. What are some beneficial nutrients that help us maintain our hearing? I heard about folic acid, but are there others? Thank you.
That is a great question, and it's one that my lab has worked very hard to try and address. The data from animal models have shown that vitamins such as beta carotene, vitamin C, vitamin E, magnesium are very helpful in preventing noise-induced hearing loss, drug-induced hearing loss, even age-related hearing loss in animal models. But the clinical trials that we led looking at prevention of noise-induced hearing loss did not have positive results with prevention in humans. Now, it could be a dosing issue, that the doses were not high enough or were not used for long enough, or it may be that those agents are not as effective in humans as in animals because of the quality of diet and people already having sufficient intake. If you look at some of the data on dietary quality, we've also looked at the national NHANES National Health Examination data, where tens of thousands of people provide nutritional information and audiometric information, as well as a variety of other health data. And dietary quality, having a healthy intake of fruits and vegetables and having low intakes of fat and salt is very strongly associated with better hearing outcomes. And the effects interact with noise exposure, and so people who have a poor diet and noise exposure have much more hearing loss than people who only have a poor diet or noise exposure by itself. So the data are somewhat unclear right now. We think that there are benefits based on the large epidemiological data sets, but we're not at a point where we can say this nutrient is the one that's important. It's probably the overall quality of the diet and having a variety of healthy nutrients and minerals that are consumed every day.
Okay, I think that we have time for one more question, and that is, are you familiar with the treatment where people listen to music that has been through a notch filter, removing the frequencies heard in the tinnitus from the music? If so, any opinion? Dr. Lobarinas, you're muted.
Okay, that's a great question, and there's been some work looking at this notch filtering. There's two types. One where there's a steady state broadband sound, so sound at all frequencies with a notch cut out, and another strategy where you have tones that are surrounding the pitch of the tinnitus, but no energy at the tinnitus pitch or the tinnitus frequency. And it's been reported that in some people, it may be helpful. But again, you know, this is one of those types of treatments that a small subgroup of people respond to it, but generally speaking, with the broader population, that has not been shown to be particularly effective. But that's not to say that that you shouldn't try it. In fact, given that it's very, very low risk, it's worth a try. You really don't have anything to lose, and there is a possibility that it might work for someone.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lobarinas and Dr. Prell, for your questions, or for the answers, and for the entire presentation. We thank everybody for joining us today. This event has been put on by the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences. If you would like to learn more about the programs and degrees offered by the school, please visit bbs.utdallas.edu. Brain Matters happens each academic year, so please watch for our next event coming soon. Again, thank you for joining us, and have a good rest of the day.